Hi, my name is D.M. Barr, and my latest novel, Saving Grace, a psychological thriller, debuts on October 15th, but it is available currently for pre-order. Kirkus calls it expertly paced and comments that its propulsive energy will keep readers turning the pages. I hope you'll enjoy it too, but that only way that can happen is if you go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble and pick up a copy. My guest today on Author Groupie is Elliot Mason, who has combined his love of history with his years of blogging and trade writing to publish a political thriller that takes a mystery from the past, our Civil War, and tries to solve it with contemporary fictional characters. Elliot has also created some unique marketing, which we will touch on also, so please sit back, enjoy, and as always, stay safe. Welcome to another edition of Author Groupie. I'm here with Elliot Mason, who grew up in Southern California and graduated from USC in 1989 with a bachelor's degree in history. And he went on to complete his master's degree in history at Azusa Pacific University. For many years, he was a featured and contributing writer for several websites, blogs, and trade magazines, which is where I got my start too. So we have that in common. In late 2019, his first suspense thriller, The Arlington Orders, was released. He spent many years piecing together this book, which is rooted in historical fact, though it takes place in modern times and told through fictional characters. His follow-up novel, The Legal Killer, is set for release in the spring of 2021. It will explore the corruption of the American criminal justice system, which we all know is total fiction. And in preparation, Elliot conducted extensive research and even spoke to a number of informants to uncover a lot of damning information. I'm dying to hear that, which forms the backbone of the novel. In addition, he has two more novels in the works due for release in 2022 and 2023. Elliot lives in Southern California and is currently active in writers' workshops, book readings, and signings. So welcome to Author Groupie.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, pleasure. So let's get right into it. Can you describe your interest and background in history and what attracted you to the combination of historical thrillers with modern day suspense historical fiction with modern day suspense thrillers?
Well, I've always been kind of a history nerd. I was one of those weird kids in high school that would read the history textbook for leisure. So that's how nerdy I was. I've always been fascinated with history. I think there's no better story than history. With all the great fiction writing out there, still in my mind, the best stories are always the real ones. And so that has always been an attraction for me. And when I went to school, I wasn't really quite sure what I wanted to do. Probably like most 18, 19, 20-year-old kids, I was kind of lost, but I did realize that I had this attraction to history. And even though I didn't have a lot of confidence in my own writing ability at the time, I did enjoy writing, but I was kind of embarrassed to show it to anyone. And people started to take notice of my writing in college, but I really never paid it much heed. I just thought, whatever, they don't really know what they're talking about. I'm not that good. And, but later on, as I became more involved in writing, as you mentioned, I wrote for blogs and trade magazines. I began to formulate some ideas and some kind of connection to historical fiction, maybe just kind of in a haphazard way. But I've always been a huge fan of historical fiction. People like Dan Brown, I admire greatly. And I think there's no better way to tell our history than to kind of create a story that's based in where it basically has the roots in our history, where we learn from it. And even though the story might be fictional, if you use real life history, it kind of gives it a kind of a new allure to it. And I've always been attracted to that.
Perfect. Well, because you started out in nonfiction writing, and that led you to fiction, did you find the transition from nonfiction to fiction difficult? And what do you think maybe were the more difficult or challenging parts of that for you?
The transition wasn't too difficult. I think I've always had kind of an imagination that kind of lended itself to that type of writing. However, for me, the most difficult part of writing was creating the dialogue between characters. That was always a very challenging aspect to writing a story. When you're writing trade magazines and you're doing interviews, you're basically quoting people, or you're kind of putting their sentences into some type of cohesive manner, but you're not really creating a dialogue between people. You're reporting information. Whereas in a historical fiction, or any type of novel for that matter, you're creating dialogue between characters and creating that natural flow of language, the ebbs and flows of the way that people talk with one another, and to try to make it seem natural and not so rigid was a very, very difficult process, and something that was really challenging to me when I first started to take on this idea of writing a fictional novel.
Yeah, for me, it was emotion and description.
Oh, okay.
So those were the hardest parts for me. So tell us about Arlington Orders.
Okay, the Arlington Orders is based on a real life event called the Dahlgren Affair. The Dahlgren Affair happened in March of 1864, so we're getting towards the end of the Civil War. A young Union colonel, he was just 21 years old, he was really just a kid, was killed in a Confederate ambush right outside the Confederate capital, Richmond, Virginia. When the Confederates searched his body, they found a set of orders on him, and the set of orders said, you are to kill President Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, you are to kill everybody in the Confederate government, and you are to burn Richmond to the ground. And why that was it was a huge breach of etiquette. It made a lot of news in the South, because at that time there was kind of a gentleman's agreement between the North and the South that civilian heads of state would not be targeted. So the South wouldn't target Lincoln and anybody in the Union government, and likewise, the Union wouldn't target anybody in the Confederate government. So the South, because it was doing very poorly in the war at that time, and because of this latest threat, decided to evacuate the capital. Now, getting the people out wasn't the real issue. The problem was they had all of their gold and silver reserves there. So all the wealth of the Confederate government was sitting in Richmond. So they literally devised a secret plan. And they had this secret operation where they were going to covertly move it to Savannah, Georgia, and then sail it to an undisclosed location where they would draw on the money when they needed it. Well, they implemented the plan, and during the transfer, it disappeared without a trace. And to this day, no one knows what happened to it. There's been a lot of theories, a lot of conjecture, but no one really knows what happened to that treasury. So what I did was I took that story, and I have modern day characters who stumble upon clues, and it becomes this deadly chase where not only is the treasure just becomes a symbol, it talks about a lot of the issues that we're going through now. And it becomes literally a deadly chase where the implications could change the very future of the country.
Wow. Well, as you said, our nation's history is a hot topic right now, especially having to do with the South and the Confederacy. So as a writer of historical fiction, do you believe we should approach our history that way? And what purpose will it serve moving forward?
I think it's important that everybody knows our history, but I think we have to be careful. As someone who studied history and researched people, I think we have to be careful of looking at people who lived in the past, especially people who lived 200, 250, 300, 400 years ago, through modern day eyes. We have the benefit of, 24-hour news cycles, instantaneous information. Here I am speaking with you. You're on one coast and I'm on another. And, people who lived 200 years ago couldn't even fathom that, let alone, understand its implications. So I think we have to be careful, but I think it's important that we know our history. And I think it's also important that when we look at historical figures, we look at both the great things they did and maybe the imperfections they had as well. A lot of the figures that we study in history, whether it be somebody like a Thomas Jefferson, obviously a brilliant man, but he was an imperfect man as well, as all our leaders were of those early days. And I think if we understand the full picture of every historical figure as well as historical situations, it gives us a better context to move forward, rather than just cherry picking what we want or what we like or what we dislike and use that as the only example. I think it's something we have to be very, very careful, because we can really travel down, in my opinion, a very dangerous path if we don't have the full understanding.
Yeah, fair enough. What do you believe is the most important legacy of the Civil War?
The Civil War changed the way that Americans thought of themselves. It's very difficult for us to understand today, but back then, if you were a dirt farmer in Mississippi, your connection to what was going on in the federal government or in Washington, D.C. was almost nothing. I mean, you had probably, I mean, it might as well have been on Mars. I mean, you just didn't have any connection with it. And we thought of ourselves as citizens of our state before we thought of ourselves as citizens of our country. The Civil War changed that, because for the first time, people weren't really thinking of themselves as I'm a New Yorker or I'm a Kentuckian or I'm a Virginian. I'm an American. That was the first time we really thought of ourselves in that context. And I think that's the greatest legacy, because now we think of ourselves, even though we do take a lot of pride in the states we're from, we do think of ourselves as Americans. And I think that's something that wasn't really true until after the Civil War.
Okay, so let's talk about your writing process. How do you go about creating a story and focusing in on portraying your characters?
The way I pick my stories is I look for inspiration. I'll look for something that just catches my interest. For instance, the Arlington Orders basically was inspired by me doing what most history nerds do, which is sitting on my couch watching the History Channel, and all of a sudden I see this thing about the Dahlgren Affair. And I knew of it, but you know, not a lot about it. So I kind of became interested in figuring out how I could tie these things together. I like to look for things that have implications for today's news or today's thinking processes. So I look for things that kind of catch my interest from a historical perspective, whether it be the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, these seminal events that that fascinate me. How did we get to this point? And those are kind of how I get my stories. When I develop characters, I always like to have my characters to be very complex from the standpoint that my heroes aren't completely wonderful and my villains aren't completely villainous. A lot of times my villains will do the wrong thing, but for the right reason. And I want, the ability is I want my readers, when they're done reading my book, going, gosh, I'm not really sure how I quite feel about this person. I want them to feel torn. If they feel torn about a character, then I feel I've done my job. So what I try to do is I try to find in my villains, I not only try to look for what they do wrong, but I also try to find the good in them as well. And I think that makes for a much interesting read. I mean, we all have our, you know, our theory about the James Bond type villains where they're completely villainous. And yeah, they're a lot of fun, but they're not realistic. I think we all have good and bad in each of us. And I try to create a character when I approach it to have a kind of a mix of both.
Okay. So what I'd also like to know is a little bit about the legal killer and some of the people you interviewed.
Well, I can tell you, I talk with a lot of people. I can't give you their names because these people took enormous risks. Yeah, they would always speak to me on condition of anonymity because a lot of these people not only risk their jobs, but their safety as well when they talk to me. They were very frightened to talk to me. But I did talk with people who were involved in the Justice Department, either currently or were involved in the prison industry. I talked with people of all kinds who were involved in that aspect in government or who had been in government. And I kind of created the story to reflect on the things that I learned. It became, a lot of them were very paranoid, and sometimes their paranoia would rub off on me because I kept on checking over my shoulder whether someone else was in the room because I was afraid of what I was hearing. But yeah, I did contact these people. They were very brave. I owe them a huge debt of gratitude for just speaking with me. And but I wanted, again, the whole idea of the legal killer was to create a story where people were interested in, where they can learn something about the system but still be entertained. Unfortunately, what I found is a lot of times Americans don't like to read just an academic work. They want to be entertained by the books they read. And so in order to teach them at least what I learned, I knew I had to bring that entertainment value. So basically, the book follows or kind of uncovers this whole juggernaut of a system that we have through the pursuit of a serial killer. That's what the story is.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, so it was a fascinating thing to research, and I learned a lot, quite a bit.
Right. So you're with a publisher, I believe, Page Publishing.
Yes.
Tell us how you came to find them and your experience with working with them.
I found them basically through researching on the internet. I actually had heard a radio advertisement for them, but I wanted to find out more about them. Now, I had some other people that were interested in my book, but the reason when I researched Page, one of the things I did like about them was the fact that first of all, the person I dealt with, a gentleman by the name of David Rodax, is fantastic. He's my publishing agent there. Fantastic guy. But I like the fact that I continue to own my work. One of the Steve Miller Band, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Steve Miller Band,
Yeah.
but yeah, great band, right? Well, I heard him in an interview, and he was one time being interviewed of what he told younger artists, what the one piece of advice that he gave them. And he said, always own your work. Always own your work. And Page Publishing allowed me to own my work. And it's a little bit different. It's not like the traditional publisher where a lot of times you might get paid in advance and they own your work. But it's the way they have it situated. It allows you to continue to have complete control over what you do. And I was very impressed with them and have been very satisfied with them as my publisher. They've been great.
That's great. What I noticed is when I was researching you have quite an extensive website. You have a good knowledge of how to market yourself, which I think is one of the things that most writers feel they are lacking. And well, I thought your trailers were fascinating because you actually have characters who are sort of thinking about what they're doing, and they're not really reading from the book, but they're talking about themselves. So I was wondering about that process. Was that your idea? Did you hire actors? How did you come upon that way of marketing yourself? And has it been worth it for you?
Oh, it's definitely been worth it. Yeah. Basically, I was kind of thinking of how my thought process was, how do we think of characters in books? And a lot of times I believe, at least I do, I think a lot of people do, we create movie trailers in our heads. And then I thought, wow, when you go to a theater, what's the first thing you see is movie trailers that garner your interest in an upcoming feature. So I contacted a guy by the name of Esteban Gomez, great guy. He's with a company called Keen Social. And we started talking, and I said, I would like to create movie trailers, but for a book. How do I do this? And so we came up with this idea about, okay, I'm going to write dialogue. I'll write the dialogue for characters that kind of bring the character to life. And the dialogue wouldn't come from the book. It would come, basically his personality is from the book, but the dialogue was completely not from the book, but completely original.
Yeah.
So I sat down and I started hammering out these 1-minute dialogues. It really didn't take me that long. I think I hammered them out in the evening. And we hired actors. So for instance, the one that's been getting a lot of attention is the guy that plays the judge, who's one of the villains in the book. John Henry Richardson. He's a great actor. He's appeared in soap operas and very long list of accolades. And he just nailed it. He was great. And all the actors did really well. And so we actually used these in a Facebook marketing ad campaign. So we sent those videos out, and the goal was to get people to take notice of the book, also to get them to sign up for my newsletter. I have a newsletter. And we literally had over 2,000 people sign up for the newsletter.
Wow.
We had a lot of response. We had people arguing about the implications of the videos. Some people didn't realize they were actors, which I found kind of fascinating. They were actually criticizing them as if they were real people. But yeah, I know, it's strange, but it worked really, really well. And that's kind of how we came up with it. So it was just kind of something we thought we'd try something different.
Oh, I thought it was a great idea. I might borrow that idea. And,
you're welcome to it.
What subjects are you going to be targeting after The Legal Killer?
Okay, well, I'm working on a couple of books right now. One book is dealing with the pharmaceutical industry, as a suspense thriller dealing with the pharmaceutical industry. And that is one I'm working on. And another one is dealing with the BDS movement and Israel. And so I'm kind of looking at both those those subject matters and kind of dealing with them in a suspense thriller.
Wow, sounds great. So last question is, would you like to read us a few pages from the Arlington orders?
Sure.
Okay, perfect.
I'm going to read you, this is from the introduction of one of probably my favorite characters, a character by the name of Osiris, who, in my opinion, is the antithesis of James Bond. He's kind of a curmudgeon, but it kind of gives his backstory. So I'll read you that one.
Great.
Here he goes. He was simply called Osiris. His true identity was a mystery to all. It was a name taken from the Egyptian god of knowledge, an all-seeing entity who was worshipped for his ability to pass on information to mere mortals. It fit him perfectly. Even his actual existence was the privileged knowledge of only a few who could afford his services. The rest relied on myths and legends. Stories were abundant, with various intelligence agencies at one time or another claiming he had received his training through their branch. The tales were so prolific it was impossible to tell which was truth and which was fantasy. Some likened him to a real-life James Bond, while others stated his reality was based in as much fact as a unicorn. After 20 years of anonymity, the doubters outnumbered the believers, which is just the way he liked it. He began operating in the shadows of the government intelligence apparatus, starting as a low-level analyst, but his talents would not be contained. Within a few years of his initiation into the business, he became the go-to man for collecting filth on foreign governments, corporate espionage, and bureaucratic sabotage. With the passing of time, his skills only sharpened. As his legend grew, so did the demands. Handpicked for some of the most important and dangerous operations the agency ever tackled, he had a success rate that was enormous. Told he was saving the nation, he risked his life daily. Yet while the missions became more difficult, their objectives became just as murky. Eventually, the only thing he could not decipher was which side he was actually serving. The passing years only brought a greater sense of disenchantment, while the bullshit he was fed by his government employer grew more difficult to swallow. What did not change was the pay. I don't need this shit anymore, he thought. I'm not working for the side of good. I'm working for bureaucrats who serve their own political objectives. If I'm going to do that, I might as well get paid. And just like that, he was gone. He didn't look the part, the dashing secret agent type he was not, of medium height, trim build, bald head, and thick beard interspersed with gray. He appeared more like a museum docent than a highly trained and skilled infiltrator. Yet those limited few who had access to him learned to never doubt his extraordinary ability. His skills were wide-ranging, from the research to reconnaissance to assassination, and the attention to detail and the results he provided were worth every pretty penny he charged, and he didn't come cheap. Yet if you needed to collect information, if you needed to spy on someone you believed was beyond reproach, or if you wanted to eliminate an individual without trace, no one could compare. His lifestyle was of complete disconnection. His communications with others was curt, especially when it came to business. It was a fleeting existence, purposely designed for people to take little notice, allowing him to disappear like a specter, a vapor that dissipated when and then was absorbed by the atmosphere surrounding it. His calling card was word of mouth, and only those with the highest connections would be granted access. The judge only managed to learn of him through a fluke. An FBI contact had caught wind of Osiris's services through a clandestine operation. With someone hurting for money, it took only a little palm greasing and a promise to never say where he obtained it to get the information. Osiris's price was steep. A week's worth of work could easily surpass 6 figures, all paid in advance. But the job was guaranteed. Any failure to deliver on what was promised would result in a full refund. In 17 years and hundreds of cases, he had never needed to make good on that policy. Normally, he would not take a client like the judge. It seemed fanciful. A treasure hunt? Really? As was his practice, he researched. And though the judge seemed potentially troublesome and difficult, the argument was surprisingly convincing. What the hell, he thought. It's easy money. Who knows, maybe there will be a little extra fruit at the end of this labor. For now, the request was simple. Keep an eye on who the judge was working with. If what his client was after was real, trust could not be extended to anyone, let alone those who might gain access through outside means. It was a game as old as the spy trade and meant to answer the same question the Romans put forth so long ago. Quis custodiet ispos custodes? Who will guard the guards?
That was great. Very, very nice. Very accessible prose. it really flowed nicely. So I look forward to reading that, and I'm sure my viewers would love to get that. And when will the next book be out as well? In spring?
Spring of next year. Yeah.
And the current book is available Amazon, Barnes and Noble, where else? Everywhere else?
Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Target, Goodreads, pretty much everywhere and anywhere you can get books. It's been at those places, those websites.
Wonderful. Well, it's been a pleasure having you. I'm really interested in reading some of this. I hope everybody goes out and purchases the books. And please, I hope you'll stay safe.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. And you stay safe as well.
Thank you.
Over the river to the city far from home. Toll booth takes my money.